we're going to do for the next half hour or so is just have a conversation with our awardees. And to begin, I want to ask both of them to tell us a little bit more than they had time to when they got their award. What led you to this work? To your work?
I did. That was Kate saying I led her to this work. Exactly. Well, I grew up in rural Florida in the Panhandle. And so for folks who know Florida, the further north you go, the deeper south you get. And there was an active Klan chapter at my high school. So it wasn't a very embracing environment for a young lesbian. But I also came from a family that was very engaged in civil rights work and human rights work. My grandfather was part of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. My grandparents had been part of the first interracial farming cooperative in the Mississippi Delta and moved to New York after a white man threatened my father, told my grandfather if he ever looked a white man in the eye again, he was going to get stomped on. And my grandfather thought it was better to move the family to New York than bury a body. So activism in my family, my parents really taught me to stand up for myself, and they just didn't know they were teaching an emerging young lesbian to stand up for herself. So a lot of the lessons that I learned and the activism that I came from that spirit of activism in my family. And so my first organizing was against apartheid when I was in college. And then at the time when I was in college, the campus group was really just a gay guy hangout. Me and there was one other lesbian that came to it. I didn't even get the jokes. It wasn't, And so the opportunity to go to London for this International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organizing Conference was, in all honesty, I thought, that sounds like a lot of fun. I wasn't going because I was deeply politically minded. I just thought it would be a nice little playground, and it was, but it also was inspirational. It changed my framework for organizing and activism. And after that, I eventually formed the organization that would grow into Equality Florida.
Do you have any mentors along the way?
Did I have mentors? I had a lot of mentors. Actually, what I've sort of glanced past was ACT UP, which was really the first time, I did things that, got me arrested or it was the place where I really tapped into the outrage. And so a lot of my mentors are not alive anymore. But there were people along the way. Phil Wilson was a huge mentor of mine when I was organizing the '93 March on Washington, and we were all of us co-chairs were very young and new to. It was good because we didn't know what we couldn't do in one respect, but Phil really took me under his wing and will always be somebody that I am proud to. I felt like I fell into the right group when I ran into him. So he's one that stands out. But there are a lot of people, many of them that aren't even part of specifically the LGBT movement, that were part of my support network. They were part of NAACP, or they were, some of my mentors I never got to meet. Audre Lorde, she inspired so much in me. And I remember I had an opportunity to meet her, and I was too overwhelmed, and I couldn't. And then the next conference that she was scheduled to speak at, I saved up money, and I was going to go, and I think she died like maybe 3 days before the conference. And so I never got to meet her, but her words, Zami, a new spelling of my name, I read it, I've had to have it rebound, 3 or 4 times. So there are a lot of people. And then peers. Kate's right. You don't sustain yourself in this work if you don't have a network of people that you lean on, that you can talk to, that know what it is to sort of process all of this poison and keep a sense of humor about it and keep the spirit alive to continue to show up. If anything, now in my life, I have to remember when new people come on board. I remember during the marriage fights, there was a new person that was working with us, and we had to stand in front of the courthouse with these people spewing this really hateful stuff. I mean, so hateful that it was almost comical, their billboards and their placards. And afterwards, when I was walking away, he was sitting in his car crying, and I thought, oh God, that's on me. I mean, we can't. It's not okay that we experience this, and it is painful. And so, but yeah, I think from colleagues, from you, Carmen, from Kate, from just there's a network of people that I think of as sort of that crew that I can lean on.
Thank you. Kate?
So as you know, I grew up in Utah, and I grew up in a pretty anti-intellectual household. I don't ever remember seeing my father. He wasn't my biological father, but he's the only father I ever knew. I don't ever remember him reading the newspaper, seeing him read the newspaper, let alone a book. My mom was a pretty voracious reader, but it was these, what do they call them?
Harlequin novels?
Yeah, the bodice rippers, those bodice ripper books. It was like, and there were never political conversations in my family, except conservative. My stepfather was a virulent racist. And I remember as a teenager realizing that if I did not stand up to him, that I couldn't be in the same room with him. But it was scary to stand up to him because he was a rager. I mean, he never hit us, but he was emotionally abusive and just raging constantly, very angry. And for me, the mentor question, and this is what changed the whole trajectory of my life, is Mrs. Lynn Miller, my current events teacher in 8th grade, who introduced me to Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and Cesar Chavez and Toni Morrison. And made me realize that you could have a life outside your own biography or outside expectations. And I still, to this day, I credit Mrs. Miller all the time because it really, she was not a product of, the Utah school teacher education system. She was radical. She swore in class on occasion, and she wasn't Mormon. And she saw something in me and nurtured that. And so that is what really sparked my interest in justice. It sparked my interest to want to be a lawyer, because at that point I saw lawyers as being at the vanguard of human rights and of social change. So I was the first to go to college in my family. I was the first to go to law school in my family. And my father was so anti-intellectual that when I told him I wanted to go to college, his response was, well, I hope you know I'm not paying for it. And then when I said I was going to go to law school, his response was, oh, so you're going to be a professional student. So my early biography was not meant to be on the path that I've been on, and I truly feel grateful every day that I have been able to do work that transcends my own, where my reach could exceed my grasp and could transcend my own biography, because so many people work for a paycheck just to pay their bills. They don't get to do work that is meaningful to them and meaningful to others, and I am acutely aware every day of the huge privilege I've had to do that work.
Thank you. As you both had pretty long careers, 20, 30 plus years now at this point. Are we the right that we're counting? Can you pick like a moment, or not a moment, but a time, something that was really just kicked your butt, but also inspired the fuck out of you?
Yeah, this was a case we had in Florida. Early on, in fact, it might even have been before I met you, Nadine. We were representing a woman who lived in Pensacola, Florida, Panhandle area, and she had lost custody of her daughter to her ex-husband, who had very little involvement in the child's life. Her name was Mary Ward. The father wasn't even sure where the kid went to school, and had spent, this child is now 8 years old, Mary had clearly been the little girl's primary caretaker, and she had lost custody to him. And I'm hearing this on the phone. I picked up the phone. It was kind of late one evening in San Francisco. The phone rang, and I just picked it up. That's because we were small then, and I was taking lots of helpline calls. And Mary proceeds to tell me this story about losing custody of her daughter because she is in a lesbian relationship. And she's telling me everything about her being the primary caretaker. Then she sought child support from him, and he countersued for custody based on her being a lesbian. This is a very familiar story. I'd heard it hundreds of times. In the first couple of years I'd been at NCLR. This is before I became executive director. I was legal director. And then she throws in the kicker. She says, oh, and you know, he's a murderer. And I remember thinking to myself, well, she just thinks he's capable of murder. Or, you know, so I said, well, Mary, has he been convicted of murder? And she said, hell yes, he served 8 years in prison for murdering his first wife.
Oh, Jesus, Mary and Ralph.
So we took Mary's case. And I flew down to Florida to argue the case with our co-counsel from Pensacola in Tallahassee. And to show you just the sacrifice I was willing to make, I wore a skirt to the argument.
That's a sacrifice.
Yes, it was. It was. And I could tell within the first, so I met Mary. First time I'd ever met her face to face. We've been on the phone many, many times in the months leading up to the argument in the case. She lost to the trial court, and only because of her sexual orientation. And the judge at the trial court completely dismissed the fact that the husband had served 8 years in prison for murdering his first wife because he paid his debt to society, so there was nothing to see there. And it didn't matter that she was the primary caretaker and everything else. So I'm 5 minutes into the argument before this 3-judge panel, all white male judges, and I could tell we were going to lose. I could tell they could not stand the fact that I was standing in front of them as an open lesbian. And so we finished the oral argument. My co-counsel and I did a great job. Our brief was totally kick-ass. The law was absolutely on our side. And as we're walking out of the courthouse, I say to Mary, you know we've lost, Mary. And she said, I know, honey. I know. Then she put her arm around me. She's comforting me. She said, but I have a really good attorney. And sure enough, we did lose. We lost 2-1. I think we got one of the judges. And then we were on appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. This is in the late 90s. It's probably 96 or so, 97. And I'm at the airport ready to fly to, I don't even remember where, my phone rings, and it's our office administrator. And I answer the phone, and Noemi says, I have some really bad news. And I said, oh God, Noemi, what? And she said, Mary Ward has died. Mary Ward died of a heart attack. That's not the end of the story. That ends the case, of course. The little girl, Cassie, who was the subject of the custody dispute, ends up fleeing her father and his wife, who she loathed and who never really wanted to raise her. And she ends up being raised by Mary's oldest daughter, who is, wait for it, a lesbian. And Cassie contacts NCLR a few years ago to get advice for her husband, who is transgender and needs employment help. So I am still in touch with all 3 of Mary's kids, still in touch with Cassie. There was a documentary called Unfit made about the Mary Ward story that is super powerful. So it was a moment where, I mean, even I can just feel my own emotional reaction. I can feel my heart, how my heart felt. I can feel my blood pressure rising. I can feel emotional. Because Mary was the sort of woman who I would have had raise my own children. And to have her go through what she had to go through, and clearly she died of a broken heart, but to know, that somehow she held on and watched over, and Cassie is okay, and her other kids are okay. And again, what a privilege that I got to meet her and be her advocate for the period of time I did.
Thank you. Wow.
Wow. I didn't know that postscript to that story. I knew that story really well. And when I say I grew up in the Panhandle, I used to sneak to Pensacola, which was the thriving metropolis, to go to the gay bar with my fake ID. And it's a military town. And I remember the first time I went, we, the first time I went to the bar in Pensacola, we forgot to come up with our fake story. You know, like, it's a university town, and I remember this woman asked me what my major was, and I just froze. Anyway, but it was a military town, so they would send the military police through the gay bar, and if the flash of a camera went off, everybody hit the ground because they were sure it was military police taking pictures so they could kick people out of the military. Anyway, so that was Pensacola. So that story was a huge part of the background of organizing. I'm thrilled to hear the outcome of that. You know, I was thinking as you were telling this story and about the question, like which thing would I bring up? The time the National Association for the Advancement of White People put out a death threat on me, or some of the uglier things that happened. But in some ways, the most powerful thing that sort of broke my heart, but also shaped me, was when I came out to my family, and it was the last day I lived under their roof. And I say it that way, well, I'll tell you why I say it that way in a minute. So it was really painful. I remember I left home with a duffel bag and slept on couches of friends, and you know, it was a time when I was going to go to college, and you have to have your parents fill out all sorts of forms, but, you know, my dad wasn't speaking to me. I couldn't get access to those things, and in retrospect, I was really grateful I never got a student loan, because my wife just paid off her student loan last year. So anyway, but that wasn't the silver lining to the story. So, you know, as a teenager, I was on my own. I was working multiple jobs. I was eating these pills that should be illegal. They're called no-dos. I don't know if they sell them anymore. But I was surviving. I was making it. I was going through college. I was getting good grades. I was doing my thing, and I was feeling very independent. And so there's a strange thing that happens in families. Like, I get invited to speak to college campuses, and I'm always brought in under the pretense that they want to talk about whether it's the marriage fight or non-discrimination laws, but what they inevitably want to really talk about is alienation from their families. And so, you know, it took years before my father spoke to me, and my brother sort of organized, unbeknownst to each of us, a Thanksgiving dinner and sat us across from each other. My father's ex-military, he's a big guy, and we never raised our voice to our father. And I just remember my brother at that Thanksgiving, like the salt shaker was right in front of me, and my dad asked my other brother to hand it to him. And I remember my older brother saying, "That is your daughter. How dare you?" And so it was the first time I really felt like all of those words about what family does and how they're supposed to stand up with you and stand up for you, I'll never forget that. And it opened up a small door. You know, my dad and I didn't talk about anything but the weather for a while. You know, there were just these, I'm not going to take you through the entire journey, but I'll take you to the place where I was going through a breakup of a really important relationship. And to my shock and surprise, it was my father who was calling every day. Are you eating? You know, are you getting sleep? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you sure this is what you want? Are you sure, you know? And I'm just thinking, I was in too much pain to say this out loud. I was thinking, who is this guy? And after I sort of stabilized myself, and I could say, you know, of all the people in the world, I never thought you would be the one supporting me like this through this journey and this pain. And he said, well, you know, I didn't understand the relationship you had, you know, because it never seemed to me like a marriage, but I recognize what a divorce looks like. And I know how to be there for my kids in a divorce. And, you know, I thought about that a lot. And I recollected that we were studiously unaffectionate, you know, around my family. We were, you know, and I understood that people in my world could say to themselves, what you have, clearly you have a relationship, but it doesn't look like marriage, so you should have access to something, but it shouldn't be marriage. Like, I could understand the sort of visceral way so many of us monitor ourselves in order to be as platonic as possible around our family. Meanwhile, my brothers are laying on the couch with their girlfriends, right? So that triggered something in my thinking as well. So flash forward many years, and my mother has passed away, and we're fighting the marriage fight. And I remember holding a meeting in Panama City, and I stayed at my dad's house, and I'm getting ready for the meeting, and he's getting dressed, and I'm thinking, where are you going? He's like, I'm coming to the meeting. I'm like, what? So he comes to the meeting, you know, and he's raising his hand to offer his suggestions, and then sometime later they say that the media people we're working with, they say, we've done one commercial that's all the plaintiffs, and they say, we need to do one for the North Florida market, and ideally, you know, if we could just like grab the perfect person, it would be like an ex-military dad, you know, who's sort of taken the journey, you know, maybe someone who's like a deacon in their church, and check, and you know, preferably black, you know, over the Panhandle. I'm like, oh my God, I'm on the call, and I'm thinking to myself, am I being, you know, is this a joke? Because they're describing my father to a T. And I said, I think I know the guy. So I call my father, and this is what, this isn't that long ago. I have been out visibly, you know, professionally gay for a long, long time. And, but the call to my father was this. I said, hey, Dad, listen, I got a quick question for you. They're doing a commercial. They describe somebody. If you want to do it, do it. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. Doesn't matter to me one way or the other. That's all right. I'm going to call you. Like, and then I hung up. And I'm sure he was just staring at the phone like, okay, whatever happened. But I realized that, and this happens, I think, to a lot of people, that we reach this detente with our families. Like a friend of mine was asked if she was out to her family. She said, yeah, but I think they forgot, which is comical, except I understand. Like when it's like, okay, boom, we did that drama, and now we'll just like paper it over. We'll never speak of it again. And so I get that. And so I felt like I got my dad back, and now was I going to push a little too far and see the frayed edges of maybe where he wasn't quite where I imagined, you know, and my little heart was going to get broken again. And so they invited him to come. He said, yeah, sure, have him call me. And they wanted me to come to the filming. I was like, nope, I can't be there. Don't even talk to me about it, honestly. And so my father did this commercial for marriage equality, and it was very much, you know, it's on Facebook, by the way. It's on, you can see it there.
Wow.
And it's so him, because at the end of it, he's like, you know, because my mom was British and biracial and very light-skinned, and they were assumed to be an interracial couple. And he was just like, let them get married, man. Let them go through it. You know what I mean? Just let them go through it. So, that was my journey.
Wow. I didn't think I was going to cry at this session. Jesus, women. Okay, so. Breathe. Next question, either one of you. So what in your work would you describe as being human rights? How, you know, so I know you've done a lot of different things, different kinds of work. I know that NCLR also talks about defending human rights. But just give us an example of what that looks like, or what that has looked like in your work.
Well, I feel like, you know, sort of Nadine's story is an example of it. Civil rights are what you fight for under a government regime where the government says these are certain things citizens get, and then you have to fight to make sure that promise is available to all. Human rights are a universal value that we all matter, and we all have the same right to dignity and freedom from oppression and possibility and opportunity. So in my work at NCLR, in my work at the ACLU, and my work now with Southern Poverty Law Center, I feel like we do it, as a lawyer, you do it in the civil rights sandbox, but it is the undergirding is human rights. And you shouldn't be dependent on a government to pick and choose who they're going to actually make the promise of civil equality under the law available to. But we've had to. I mean, every community has had to. Our country has broken that promise many, many times and then never made it when it should have made it to everyone who was in the country. So I read your piece that you spoke earlier yesterday, Carmen, and I think human rights is a much more, not only it's an aspirational framing for sure, but I also feel like it's a much more accurate framing of what we seek. And it's a much more accurate way to describe what we want to achieve, because civil rights, I mean, marriage equality is a perfect example. Yes, I'm happy to have been a part of winning marriage for same-sex couples in this country. I'm proud of that work. That's important work. It changed the lives of a lot of people. It moved the conversation in a totally different way. But it falls far short of what we ultimately want for all queer people, to be able to form any families you want, to have the government not care about what your family structure looks like, not care how many people are in your relationship, not care how many individuals are interdependent, and that all of those family formations are entitled to the same equal worth and dignity and protection as any other structure that seems more familiar or traditional. So, you know, we're on a journey, and civil rights is part of the journey, but we won't be close to any sort of finish line unless we have a human rights frame.
Thank you. Nadine?
I was so taken up by that, I forgot the question. It was just, the human rights.
Human rights, yeah.
You know, Dr. King said this thing. He said, you know, the civil rights movement is not just about the uplift of black people. It is about injecting a glorious new strain of love into the veins of society. And
Wow, say that again.
I said the civil rights work is not just about the uplift of black people. It is about injecting a glorious new strain of love into the veins of society. And I think that is our work at the end of the day. I mean, you know, there's a lot of places, we talk much more now about intersectionality, and I'm glad, you know, and in so many ways, when I think about doing this, and I have opportunities to work in different parts of the human rights, you know, the range of human rights issues, but I feel like one of the things that drove me to this, you know, as a black woman, I had the support of my family up until I came out. And then it was a process of reestablishing that support. There's something about queerness that can sever such an elemental bond between families that few other things do. And to me, tackling that, where ideology can sever that, you know, in some ways, our country is experiencing this, where, you know, people feel orphaned by parents who have, you know, been sort of, their brains have been cannibalized by Fox News, and they can't, you know, connect across this rift of living in completely separate realities. And I think that queer people have been experiencing that for forever, you know, where you're not even able to communicate across the ideological, religiously, you know, imposed separations that can cause a parent to throw their own child out of their home. And to me, there's something so elemental in doing this work that speaks to human rights that I feel like the work that I do at Equality Florida is critical in causing people to push past their the indoctrination that they've had. And I think right now our country is going through this you know, I think it was Arundhati Roy that said, she basically said, the fixation on Trump is a dangerous thing in that it can obscure the fact that he is, I'm completely bastardizing the quote, but that he is the inevitable product of the system that we have to address. Now, I agree with that, but I think we have to do both. I think you have to call out, there's a group called Erase Hate, run by ex-Aryan Brotherhood or neo-Nazis, and their message is, if you see graffiti, erase it. If you see a message, challenge it, no matter what the circumstance is. Because it's not just about an individual act of racism or aggression. It is about not allowing it to be normalized. So I think we have to mock and challenge and push back on Trump as the avatar of all of that, and simultaneously understand that his removal, his defeat, or the end of his second term, whatever comes first, is not the end. And in some ways, I think the marriage fight is one of the places that gives me hope. Because, you know, we lost and lost and lost and lost, and then we were sick of losing, and we couldn't lose anymore. We kept losing. You know, it was one of those things where there was no happy ending coming until that moment when we stopped talking about it in these antiseptic terms as though it was a contract, and we started talking about love and fighting for the people, the ability to protect the people that we love, our kids, you know, all of these conversations that shifted. That's where my father's framework shifted. That's where my family's framework shifted. And so I say all that to say, we are seeing, you know, when people say this isn't the America I know, yeah, it is. It has reached a place where there's no nice little frosting over the top, where the pain is not simply being absorbed by certain sectors, it's being spread out so more people are feeling the pain and seeing the ugliness that has always been there. But that is when the choice is called. As in every civil rights movement, the whole point of it is we want to make you look at things as they are, not silently, you know, you're going to have to look at those young black people at a lunch counter being abused by white people and not pretend that you don't see it, and then you have to decide, what will I do about it? Is it okay with me? And if it's not, what will I do about it? And so right now, our country is going through a moment of going, I see it, I can't pretend I don't see it. Am I okay with it? And if I'm not, what will I do about it? So I think it's going to be really painful for a while, but it's also the only way we're going to get through to the other side in a world where we are increasingly a nation of old white people and young brown people. And we are going through the roiling that was inevitable, you know, because we have not addressed the fundamental, you know, the original sin of America, which is racism. And we're going to have to. And right now we are in a murder-suicide pact where there are people willing to destroy everything, including the planet, to keep the power dynamic of white supremacy in place. And there will not be advancement on queer issues that is lasting and deep and real. There will not be a shift around sexism and anything else we're working on until we address the fundamental sin at the origin of this country, which is racism.
Hear, hear.
All right. Let's wrap it up with one last question. I think Nadine started to speak to it, and that is the future.
Well, look, Nadine is the embodiment of how to eloquently capture the chickens have come home to roost. And here's where we are. And it really is I feel like a make or break moment. I think about my grandkids, because if we do not face how this country got rich and who was left, who benefited and who was deprived, and generations of black folks who continue to be made vulnerable and on the margins of society and then blamed for being on the margins of society, if we don't have an honest conversation, for those of us who are white, about the whole reason we're in this mess is because our forebearers and previous generations of white people refuse to actually have an honest conversation about this, then I fear. That's what makes me fear for the future of my grandkids. And Trump is just a manifestation of our failure to come to terms with that, and thinking that these voters who voted for Obama, they thought that was all they had to do to absolve themselves of centuries of slavery and racism in this country. And then when it didn't work out quite the way they wanted, they reverted back to form. So I do think this is the most important conversation in this country right now. And I will say, I agree with Nadine, it's happening more. We are engaging it more than we ever have before, but of course the pushback is enormous. and at all costs, people are willing, in this murder-suicide pact, which I love, Nadine, willing to do anything to stop us from meaningfully having that conversation. So it really is, look, the place of white people in this culture is to be more courageous than we've ever had to be at any previous time, to have the courage of what it is to be a black woman in the United States right now. If we could bring that kind of courage as white people to what we do every single day, and the conversations we're willing to engage in, we may yet be okay, but that's the kind of courage we have to bring to bear, and that's the kind of commitment we have to bring to bear.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's been a long luncheon. I appreciate your staying with us throughout. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Nadine, for your gracious words. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.